today's episode, I'd like to talk about Plato's psychology. First thing to be said for it is that it's a theory of the soul, which makes it sound strange and non-modern, but that's all that psychology means. Psychology is a Greek word, or at least an origin, and psyche, or psyche, is Greek for soul, and logos is Greek for, well, many things, but theory, account, study of. So you put psyche and logos together, you get psychology, the study of the soul. Now, the soul is a word that nowadays is freighted with metaphysical significance, meaning that it's the thing that survives you in the afterlife and so on, because of the monotheistic religions, especially Christianity in our culture. And although Plato will have an immortal soul, he will argue for one. In this psychology that I'm about to describe, it's not important whether it survives death or not. It's not yet that kind of soul at this point in his dialogue, The Republic. This argument I'm going to give an explanation of comes from Book 4. So Plato's psychology is in some ways unusual, as you'll see. At least it's not evolutionary psychology, it's not Freudian psychology, it's not behaviorism, and so on. It's ancient psychology. But I'm going to present it as something true. That is to say, I believe that it's true. I've written some online articles for which we can supply links, arguing that it subsumes some of the best recent psychology, especially Darwinian evolutionary psychology and modular theories of the mind. And I won't get into that today. I'll be giving just an explanation of the text, Book 4 of Plato's Republic. But that will be in the background, and I may mention it from time to time. So when I say it's a psychology, as I say, it's not about the survival of the soul after death. It's rather about the constitution of the soul. And by constitution, a word that's very important for Plato, because the Greek word is politeia, from which we get politics, polis, the city-state. By constitution, I mean how it's put together. What's really important is that for Plato, the soul has parts, as we'll say, eventually 3 parts. What does that mean? Well, the soul in the Greek language of this time and these thinkers is the life-giving principle. And really what's important from the beginning when discussing or thinking about Plato's psychology is that the soul is the desiring in us. So whatever it is about us that desires, whatever it is that provokes, or at least is the agent of desire, that's what the soul is. And so when we say that the soul has 3 parts, what that's going to mean is that there are 3 types of desire in us. This is really crucial. So many misinterpretations of Plato's psychology begin by not recognizing that fact. So hold that central in your mind throughout this discussion, that the soul for Plato is the desiring, and that what we're aiming to show with Plato is that there are 3 types of desire. So to say that there are 3 parts of the soul is simply to say that there are 3 incompatible types of desire in every human being. Now, the argument for this conclusion begins with a logical principle that will eventually be called the law of non-contradiction, or the principle of non-contradiction, sometimes the law of contradiction or the principle of contradiction. It's Aristotle who makes this principle most famous. He states it in his Metaphysics, and it's considered thereafter a foundational principle of most philosophy. In fact, it's not really until the 19th century that it starts to be challenged by thinkers like Hegel and Nietzsche, who are deliberately reviving the thinking of Heraclitus, a philosopher from a century before Plato. And in this passage, Plato seems to have Heraclitus in mind when he states this principle. So just to retrace that history, Plato's going to begin this argument with the statement of a principle. Let's call it the principle of non-contradiction, which Aristotle will later call it. And the principle is that, well, I'll read you the text. I'll read you the first sentence. There are 2 sentences to this principle. It is clear that the same thing cannot do or undergo opposite things. Now, there's going to be more to it, but that's the essential principle. Let's take out the "it is clear that," which is just Plato's way of signaling this is important. Here's the principle. The same thing cannot do or undergo opposite things. By opposites, we could say contraries or contradictories. So the same thing, something can't do or undergo opposites, contradictories, or contraries. However, as true as that might be, it admits of some qualifications, not quite exceptions, but qualifications. And he goes on to state those. So he says, not at any rate, in the same respect, in relation to the same thing, at the same time. So there are 3 qualifications. So take the principle, the same thing cannot do or undergo opposites. Well, it's easier for me to demonstrate this in person when I'm teaching, but you can imagine me walking towards this microphone and walking away from this microphone. And so I'm going both towards and away. Those are opposite things. And here I am, the same thing, going both towards and going away. Have I broken this most fundamental principle of all, as Aristotle calls it? Well, no, according to Plato, because he has a qualification there that the same thing cannot do or undergo opposites at the same time. So I'm going towards at this time, and I'm going away at this time. So I haven't broken the principle because of one of those 3 qualifications. There's another qualification in relation to the same thing. At the moment, I'm going towards the microphone, but I'm also going away from a window that's behind me. So am I undergoing or doing opposite things? It seems so. I'm going both towards and away, but they're not in relation to the same thing, because in relation to the microphone, I'm going toward. In relation to the window behind me, I'm going away. So if I'm going to break the principle so far, I have to do, the same thing, have to do or undergo opposite things at the very same moment, at the same time, and in relation to the same thing. There's a final qualification that's not as important for our purposes. It's a kind of technical qualification. It's in the same respect. Scholars, at least the ones that I've agreed with who've debated this point, have convinced me that by respect here, he means types of motion. And it's revealed by an example he gives. If you have a top spinning on a table, if it's stationary in the sense that it's not moving left or right, backwards or forward, but planted in the same place, the axis is still, then it's stationary. But if it's spinning, it's also moving. So how can it be both moving and stationary at the same time? Well, it's doing so in different respects. He means here precisely different types of motion. And it's going to be important, as a technical detail anyway, that the motions that he's concerned with are linear motions. That is, the left and right, forward and backward, the pushing and pulling that we feel and sometimes demonstrate when we move towards the objects of our desire or move away from things from which we're repulsed. So let me just summarize by reading again the crucial sentence. It is clear that the same thing cannot do or undergo opposite things, not at any rate in the same respect in relation to the same thing at the same time. So that's actually just one sentence, Plato's statement of what will later be called the principle of non-contradiction. That's the fundamental principle from which this entire argument begins. And we subjected it to a few counterexamples, as we say, objections, scenarios that didn't seem to fit it, like me going towards and away from the microphone, me going towards the microphone away from the window, the spinning top, and so on. And with those 3 qualifications, the principle can handle these apparent counterexamples. Plato leaves it to our imagination, and I leave it to yours to think of other possible counterexamples, and he's confident that this principle will be able to handle them. So assuming with him that that's correct, let's move on. There's one more sentence in this paragraph that is going to be helpful for us, and it gives the agenda for the argument. It shows how the argument's going to work. And it says, so if we ever find that happening here, we will know that we are not dealing with one and the same thing, but with many. So when he says, if we ever find that happening here, what that means is something that's doing or undergoing opposites in the same respect at the same time in relation to the same thing. If we find something that is doing or undergoing opposites in those 3 ways, then we will know that we are not dealing with one and the same thing, but with many. In other words, something might appear to be one, but if it does or undergoes opposites in those 3 ways simultaneously, then it has to be more than one thing. And when it comes to the soul, although it might appear one thing, the human being, if we don't even want to talk psychology, but just the human being, this thing with skin that wanders around, it appears to be one thing, and yet it can experience, undergo, even do opposite things. And that's going to be evidence that unless the principle of non-contradiction has been falsified in this one case, the human being, that's going to be evidence that the human being has three parts, that it's many. So, how does it work? Well, I have before me a glass of water, and I'm thirsty, so I experience a desire for that glass of water. I'm pulled, if you like, towards it, and that's where the linear motion is important. I'm pulled towards this glass of water by some inner impulse, which we call a desire for the water. But imagine that I learn that the water has been poisoned with rat poison. Or if that's too dramatic, I'm going to be having surgery in the next 12 hours, and my surgeon has told me don't drink any water within 12 hours of the surgery. Or maybe it's just salt water. Or maybe it's been sitting out too long and I'm suspicious of it. In any case, there might be any number of reasons that I am, if you like, repulsed by the water, at least that I don't drink it despite my desire for it. So here I'm undergoing opposites, both an attraction towards the water and a repulsion from the water. Now, if the principle is true, I, this human being, this soul, if you like, am undergoing opposites in relation to the same thing, this glass of water, at the same time, right now, and in the same respect, in this linear way, both pulling towards and pushing away from it. So if that's the case, then I must be many. If we're talking about the soul, the desiring, which we stipulated from the beginning, then there must be two incompatible desires operating here. And now we're off. So far, there are two parts of the soul, and he's going to argue for three. It's going to get more complicated when we get to three. And the way that we get there is by categorizing the types of desire, by characterizing the types of desire. So in this case, I am attracted to water, and something tells me not to. Something in my soul, another desire, pushes me away so that I'm at this point where I'm not moving at all. What is the nature of those two desires? Well, one is straightforward. The thirst for the water is a basic bodily necessity. And I don't think there are more than 5 of these. I'm happy to be corrected, but in teaching this over the years and asking people, I think really there are just 4, if you like, necessities, and a 5th that's a common desire to be lumped in with the 4. And those are, if I remember correctly, thirst for drink, hunger for food, a feeling of cold when we need to be warmed, and a feeling of heat when we need to be cooled. So our body seeks the right temperature, and we have these sensations in our body that tell us move to a warmer place, move to a colder place. And finally, of the first 4, fatigue when we're tired, when we want to sleep. So those are 4 basic bodily necessities: that we have food, that we have drink, that we have the right body temperature, and that we get enough sleep. And we have 4 corresponding, we'll call them appetites, bodily appetites, special kinds of desires for these things that we need in order to survive. And here I will talk a little about more recent psychology, at least since the 19th century. We have a good story now, thanks to Charles Darwin, for why we have those particular desires, because our ancestors had those desires, and the individuals of our species who didn't have those desires didn't survive at all, or they didn't survive long enough to reproduce. So when we bring in reproduction, we come to the 5th of the bodily appetites, and that's lust for sex. And for the same reason, the organisms that are our progenitors, our ancestors, they had that desire, which led them to reproduce and generate a chain of beings, because this goes even previous to human beings, from our roots in the animal species. And the ones, that is the human beings or the other animals that didn't have that desire, didn't reproduce. And so they didn't generate offspring like us, who have the desires of our ancestors, which were sexual. So there's a Darwinian story, a simple Darwinian story, for why we have those 5, if I'm right, it could be 6, 7, 8, whatever it is. It's going to be a finite number of bodily appetites. There's going to be the appetites that the individuals of the species had to have if they were to pass on in frequency their genetic material to the next generation. And we are the recipients of that genetic material. So we have those 5 basic appetites. At any rate, let's just go back to the one that was in our example, and that is thirst for this glass of water I have before me. And we can characterize it then as a bodily appetite. What's pushing me back? Well, in any of those cases, the salt water, I know it will make me sick. The surgery example, I know that it could cost me my life, or at least complicate my surgery, and so too the rat poison. So even though I, let's say, know those things to be true, whichever one we're imagining, if I'm really thirsty, I still feel that pull towards the water. I still feel that swelling in my tongue, or that longing in my throat for that liquid that I see before me. So I have a judgment that this water is bad for me, that I've come to through thinking about what's good for me. And yet I have this appetite in me that's resistant to that judgment, that just wants something that looks like this does, namely a clear liquid in a glass. So a provisional way of characterizing these two desires that are in conflict when I sit here not drinking, although thirsting, provisional characterization would be: one is a bodily appetite that I get through my genetic inheritance, and we can say of it that it doesn't think about what's best. It's an immediate reaction based on certain appearances, especially sensible appearances. So you have an animal of a certain sort. If it sees something of a certain sort, it's going to experience thirst, or it's going to experience hunger, it's going to experience lust, and so on. In us, there is also this ability to think about what's best. And in this case, we're assuming for the example that living is what's best for me. And so that's why I decide not to drink it when I've seen the rat poison poured into it, because I want what's best for me, and living is what's best for me. And that drink would frustrate what's best for me, namely, it would kill me. So provisionally, let's say that we have two desires, two types, I should say, two types of desire. One is bodily appetite that we characterized in that kind of Darwinian way earlier. And then the second one is a rational desire. That is, thinking of reason as having as its goal what's best. So these are indeed the titles that Plato gives to these two parts. One is in the Greek, it's epithumeitikon, which is best translated as appetitive desire, and then the logistikon. And there's our friend Logos from Psych-ology. The logistikon is the rational desire. Now, that's a peculiar phrase in English, rational desire, because for whatever reason, our language favors a rivalry between desire and reason. But that's the stumbling block for many interpreters of Plato. They think of the rational part of the soul as not desiring, and after that, they usually completely misunderstand what Plato's up to. So we're not going to make that mistake. We're going to remember that the rational part of the soul is that which experiences rational desire, which is desire for what's best, and that is not immediately apparent in the way that the water is apparently satisfying to my thirst, my bodily appetite, and my thirst relies merely on appearances to be provoked. By contrast, my rational desire is seeking after what's really good and doesn't trust appearances, but collects experiences and compares the present appearance with past appearances and tries to see through the appearances to a reality behind or below or beyond the appearances, some truth about what's really good for me. So there are the first two parts of the soul, the appetitive, which is going to be at the bottom in his characterization, and the rational, which is at the top, at least when the soul is functioning properly, where being at the top means which part is in charge. So if we just had two parts of the soul, at least as we've characterized them, you'd live a better life if your reason were in charge than if your appetite were in charge, because your appetite goes merely for what seems to satisfy it. And so it will drink poison water, it will eat rotten food, it will have sex with the wrong person at the wrong time. By contrast, the rational part, the rational desire, is calculating what's best for the whole soul and acting accordingly. And if the appetites behave according to reason's prescriptions, then one will live a good life. At least that's the formula that Plato has. We'll talk more about it at the end of this episode, because we still need to introduce what's called the third part of the soul, which, when things are functioning properly, is situated between the appetite and reason. And this he calls the spirited part. And maybe I'll just leave that unexplained for the moment, because we don't want to prejudice the argument by saying what it is. It'd be better to look at some examples and then see why a third part is necessary. Well, the example that he gives is a colorful one. The person's name in this particular scenario is named Leontius, and he is wandering back home from the port city. The port city is called the Piraeus, and he's wandering back to Athens. I think that's where he's wandering from. It doesn't really matter. He wanders by a pile of bodies that have been recently executed, and they are young male bodies, and he can't help but look. He tries not to look, but he gives in to his desire to look, and when he does so, he holds open his eyes. And, I could be imagining that he's holding open his eyes. I'll try and find the passage in a second. There it is. So I'll just read this passage because the details matter. For a while he struggled and put his hand over his eyes. Yeah, so he covers his eyes. But finally, mastered by his appetite, so there's an appetite to look at that pile of bodies. That's going to be important, because most readers misunderstand this passage. They think that he's trying to look at the bodies the way people nowadays will look at a car accident when they're on the highway, when they drive by and everyone's going slowly, because they're doing just that, rubbernecking. That's the lens through which people read this passage, and it's got to be wrong, because the word is appetite. Leontius, mastered by his appetite, he opened his eyes wide and rushed toward the corpses, saying, "Look for yourselves, you evil wretches. Take your fill of the beautiful sight." He's speaking to his own eyes in that instance. It doesn't say that he's holding them open, but they're wide open after he's been holding them shut with his hands. And he's yelling at them and saying, "Look for yourselves, you evil wretches. Take your fill of the beautiful sight." So two things. Well, there's a conflict here. He's trying not to look at the bodies. He looks at the bodies. So there's a desire to look at the bodies and a desire not to look at the bodies. The desire to look at the bodies is called an appetite. And as a footnote in my translation, the CDC Reeve translation, the most recent one, says, there was a figure in an ancient comedy named Leontinus, who was notorious for his fetish for pale young boys. Now, the versions of the Greek text that we have now in the 20th century are all the product of multiple copies. They had to be preserved for a couple thousand years before the printing press by being hand copied. And there were only a few editions of some texts. So scribal errors got introduced from being copied over and over again. And if there weren't many editions to correct the error, then that error would stand. So it's possible, and it seems to me likely in this instance, that one or the other was a mistake. Either Leontius was a mistake or Leontinus was a mistake, that they're referring to the same person. And so this guy that we know about through this fragment of ancient comedy had a sexual fetish for pale young boys. And then here is this person, I think the same person described by Plato, walking past a pile of young pale boys. And so he has a sexual appetite. What other appetite would this be? He has a sexual appetite to look at the pile of bodies, but there is a taboo in Greek society, as in ours, against necrophilia. And so he doesn't want to look at the bodies because he knows that that's shameful, but his sexual appetite overpowers him. So he looks at the bodies, and then he gets angry. Of course, I think he must first get ashamed. That's not described, but he's got to be ashamed. And then, as so often in human life, when someone gets ashamed and someone else has made them ashamed, they get angry at the person who made them ashamed. It's much easier to be angry at someone else than to be ashamed in yourself, because shame is such a powerful and painful emotion. Here he gets angry, but there's no one else to get angry at because he's the one who's looking. No one's made him do that. He made himself do that, or some part of his soul made him do that, his sexual appetite, the appetitive part of his soul. But he's getting angry. It's easier to deal with the anger than the shame. So what's he going to get angry at? his own eyes, as if his eyes deceived him. He's alienating his eyes from himself. And look for yourselves, you evil wretches. Take your fill of the beautiful sight. So he's angry. That's why this third part of the soul that we'll conjecture for the moment is called the spirited part. Anger is a typical emotion of it, and there are other emotions that are characteristic of the spirited part of the soul. Envy is another, pride, vanity. I think that these are not all the emotions, but many of the emotions, the ones of the spirited part of the soul, are emotions that regard our social status. And they have to be aware of social morality, social convention, because it's according to propriety, it's according to our behavior through those standards that we either rise or fall in social hierarchies. So, a quick way to fall in a social hierarchy is to do something taboo, such as be seen as a necrophiliac. Shame is the appropriate reaction in that case. It's a way of showing to the society that this is not your better self. You wish it hadn't happened, and it would be possible to be readmitted into the society after doing something that egregious. Think about envy, the way in which it regards our social status, and it looks up, wanting to be with the people who are higher, thinking when it turns to resentment that the people who have the higher social status don't deserve that social status, and so on for other emotions. This reaction that Leontius is having is not rational. And I don't mean it's irrational in the sense it's crazy. What I mean is that it's not rational desire as I characterized it earlier. It's not a deliberation about what's really good. It's not assessing the appearances, using past experience to make a determination about what's really good beyond, through, or above the appearances. It's relying on another appearance. And in this case, it's the appearance of social status, social convention. And there's a gap between social convention and what's really good, as is made obvious by the fact that most societies get something wrong about what's really good. In fact, I don't think there's ever been a society that's gotten everything right about what's really good. So what we'll call morality now, social convention about human behavior, moralities will differ from what's really good. And if you're in any society, you will be confronted with a choice sometimes between doing what is moral in this sense, doing what is socially approved, and doing what's really good, which might be the opposite of that. So, famous clear-cut example is in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, where you could be in a small enough circle that you would have only anti-Semites for friends and for a boss and so on, and there would be all kinds of social pressure to do and say anti-Semitic things, and so the spirited part of your soul, which is tracking your social status and trying to promote it, would have an incentive or a desire to say and do those things. But you could assess the appearances of your society. You could remember what life was like before the 30s, and from the wisdom traditions that you had inherited, and from your own intuition for that matter, and determine that it's not really good. In fact, it's really bad to say and do those things. So that would be a conflict then between two types of desire. One desire for social status and another desire for what's really good. So to argue for a third part of the soul, we would need a part which can be in conflict with the appetitive part. And there we have it already with Leontius, where his anger was at war with his sexual appetite, and his sexual appetite won, but his anger didn't go down without protest. And then all we need is an example of that same part, characterized now as attending to social convention and trying to promote one's social status. All we need is an example of that same part in conflict with reason, with rational desire. And this example of 1930s Germany is a clear-cut case. But as I say, I think in any human life, there are going to be multiple instances where one has to choose between what's really good and what your social circle thinks is good, and how you might promote your social status by cooperating with those standards. Of course, the Nazi Germany example is not Plato's, but he has others that are a little foreign to us. So, for example, Odysseus, after he returns from his 20-year adventure, 10 years fighting against Troy and 10 years trying to get back home, after he returns home, he finds that his whole house has been occupied by the so-called suitors, the nobles of his island, Ithaca, who are trying to get his wife to marry them, arguing that Odysseus, is never coming back. He comes back in a costume because he's afraid that they might kill him. And in his costume, as a beggar, they dishonor him, not recognizing who he is. They dishonor him. I think one of them throws an apple at him, and he's enraged because, of course, that breaks, it breaks social convention. If Odysseus were to be revealed as king of Ithaca, you're not to throw an apple at the king, but it breaks more importantly, his own estimation of his own social status. He esteems himself as deserving better than that, and by receiving lower treatment than he feels he deserves, the reaction is anger. And so his anger impels him to draw his sword or to attack in some way. But his reason says no to, his reason actually is depicted as speaking to his chest, which is where the Greeks thought anger was located, speaking to his chest and mastering it. And this is the foreign part. Odysseus does that so that he can retreat. He can persuade his son to join him, and they can return with the plan, and they can slaughter all the suitors, which they do with much gore and revenge in one of the final books of the Odyssey. Now, is that really good? Well, Odysseus may have thought so. Certainly he thought it was better than having the apple thrown at him. But I think Homer goes above Odysseus and has us ask whether that's really good, because after Odysseus has settled into his castle, after he's killed all the suitors and his wife has recognized him and they've resumed their married life, he gets restless and goes on another adventure, as if the victory that he won there at home wasn't in fact really good, and then he's still looking for what's really good. So now we have a three-part soul in Plato. Uppermost, at least again, when the soul is functioning properly, is rational desire. In the middle is spirited desire, the thumoedon it's called. And lowermost is appetitive desire, the epithumeitikon. So the logistikon, the thumoedon, and the epithumeitikon, this three-part or tripartite soul of Plato. And that order, that rank order, is when the soul is functioning well. And when it does so, reason is in charge so that its determination of what's really good sets the agenda for the soul. And then the middle part, the spirited part, gets angry or envious or proud or vain or whatever according to the judgment of the reason. So that there, it's not so much that the person gets angry according to social status, but according to the esteem that reason has set for it. So this is going to be a person who's not going to have the typical social reactions of somebody who hasn't thought beyond their social conventions, but rather is going to have emotions that have a different orientation. Now, again, the spirited part of the soul can't determine what's really good. It has to rely on reason to do that, but it's become obedient to reason and takes the judgments of what reason says to be good as its substitute for social convention. And then finally, the appetites, which aren't as obedient to reason as the spirited part of the soul is in Plato's story, but can be formed and shaped by reason. So, take a craving for carbs, for example. Imagine you decide to go on a low-carb diet. You give up bread and pasta and sweets, and then the next day you're craving carbs desperately. If you went with your appetite, your hunger, then you would just redouble your eating of carbs, but your reason is guiding you, and you check your appetites and you heed your diet. But over time, the appetite for the carbs diminishes. Your body doesn't crave them in the same way. So the appetites can't be immediately persuaded by reason the way the spirited part of the soul can, but over time they can at least be shaped. And just to see the contrast, that's an example I use when teaching, you might get angry if somebody cuts you off in traffic. But what if somebody cuts you off in traffic one morning and then you somehow realize, by getting a glimpse inside the car that a woman is delivering a baby inside that car and they're trying to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. Well, chances are your anger is going to disappear immediately, unlike your craving for carbs, which will take time and habit. There's something about the emotions, these spirited ones, that respond quickly, in the best cases, at any rate, to judgments. So that's a description of the best kind of soul. And you won't be surprised if you've read much Plato to know that that's what he considers to be the soul of a philosopher, someone who's rational. And what that means in this context is somebody who is ruled, as he says, by rational desire, somebody for whom judgment about what's really good determines the shape of that person's life and his or her, because he thinks that women have as much chance to be philosophers if they're given the same education as men do, that his or her emotions, the spirited ones, will respond almost immediately to the judgment of reason, and the appetites will be shaped over time. And that person has the best chance of living a good life because of that rule by reason. But there are going to be other types of soul according to which other parts of the soul rule in a person. So it's going to be possible that in another person, not the philosopher, the spirited part of the soul rules. That's going to be a person for whom the desire to achieve social status is going to be the most important desire in their life, the strongest desire in their life. So that if they have a choice between, let's take the case from earlier, achieving social status in the 30s in Germany against their better judgment of what's really good, they'll go for the social status, not for what's really good. Similarly, there can be an appetitive person, somebody in whom the appetites rule. And there are going to be varieties of this kind of person that we'll get to in a later episode, because there are different appetites. As I mentioned, there are those 5 appetites, and they can come into conflict with each other. So Plato doesn't think it's a hard and fast rule there are 3 parts of the soul. He grants that there can be an infinite number, but just take those 5. There can be a conflict in your soul between hunger and fatigue. So you can be in bed, but hungry, and then sort of stuck in bed because even though you're hungry and you want to get up and have a pizza, you just don't want to get up because you're too tired. And you can be experiencing that pushing away from the bed and the pulling towards the pizza and vice versa. So there could be many parts of the soul as we go down. What is it that binds them all into one part, the appetitive? Plato observes that money plays this role, or at least it can. And I think what he has in mind is that money has many peculiar properties, but one of them is that if you have a sufficient marketplace and if you have enough money, you can buy the satisfaction of any appetite, certainly any one of those 5 appetites, but even any variety. So if you have the right marketplace and enough money, you can buy not just food, but any food you want. And so too for all those other desires. So even though they're fragmentary, even though the appetitive part of the soul, in fact, has parts that can come into conflict with each other, money provides a kind of pseudo-unity to those parts. And Plato imagines a kind of person for whom the desire for money is so strong that it unites the appetitive part of the soul into one goal, the desire for money, and then that dominates the soul. So that when that person encounters a conflict between, a situation where they can make money but lose face, they'll go for the money, or they can, make money and do something they consider to be bad, that really bad. That is, they'll not just according to social convention, but really bad according to the judgment of their reason. They'll do what it takes to earn the money. So we got roughly now 3 types of people: a truth-loving person in whom rational desire is dominant, an honor-loving person in whom spirited desire is dominant, and a money-loving person in whom the desire for money is dominant. And of course, Plato's recommending the truth-loving way of life, the life of the philosopher, and that's arguably the goal of the entirety of his dialogue, the Republic. But he recognizes that that's going to be rare, that's going to require a certain kind of person to begin with, he thinks, and then a certain kind of education that gives that desire what it needs in order to achieve its goal. And he thinks that most people are going to be either money-loving or honor-loving. And it's a real question, in my mind at any rate, whether he's right about that. First of all, whether it's true as he thinks that you're born as one type or another, and what kind of education can be given to accelerate the desire for truth, to bring it out of those who either anybody who's capable of it, or those special people he thinks are born with a special disposition towards it. And then there's another question of education, which is, if somebody lives a life of a certain sort, let's say a money-loving life, then the appetitive part of their soul has become dominant. Can education intervene and rewire their soul, so to speak, to give them a push they need to become more honor-loving than money-loving, or let alone more truth-loving than either of the other two loves? Those are questions that Plato doesn't entertain. He doesn't seem to think that once you're a person of a certain type, you're going to become a person of a different type. And I think I disagree with him. I think about it all the time. But really, I think it's an empirical question that can only be studied if we approach the psychological data with these kinds of hypotheses in mind, these Platonic hypotheses. So I'll end where I began, which is that I think this is a true psychology. I gave a hint of how it can accommodate Darwin at the level of the appetites. I think it can accommodate Darwin at the level of the spirited part of the soul as well. Darwin had a theory not only of natural selection, which I mentioned briefly earlier, but also a theory of sexual selection. And he recognized that within each sex there would be an intense competition for status. And he focuses mostly on the competition between males for the attention of female mates, in the famous example of the peacock. But those are the kind of emotions that Plato's talking about, especially with his concern with male culture, given that he's a Greek. Those are the kind of emotions that he's concerned about, namely, how do men get ahead in a competition with each other for social status. So I think, again, he can accommodate the Darwinian story about the emotions, just as he did with the Darwinian story for the appetites. And that leaves, finally, reason. Where does this rational desire for what's really good come from? That's not in the Darwinian story, but I've argued in writing that, in more detail, that the Darwinian story needs that desire, just as every scientific enterprise needs that story, because what is science but the pursuit of the truth? And unless scientists are really just, without admitting it, looking for social status or money, to be a true scientist, they have to be looking for the truth. And only with a desire for that will they do that. And so there has to come, if not from evolution, and this is where Plato does start blending into metaphysics or a story of the soul that's much more than what gets studied in psychology departments nowadays. There has to be an origin for that part of the soul elsewhere. That's where I'll end for today.